The richest man in the city was eating from a trash can, and nobody knew. David Carter stood outside the hospital with dirty clothes and messy hair, his hands shaking as he held a small cup, begging for coins. People walked past him like he was invisible. Some looked at him with disgust. Others just looked away. But David wasn't what he seemed. He owned half the buildings in this city. His company made millions every single day. Right now, somewhere across town, men in expensive suits were signing papers with his name on them. But none of that mattered anymore, because 3 months ago, his 8-year-old son Tommy got very sick, and David made a choice that changed everything. 3 months earlier, David sat in his giant office on the top floor of the tallest building in the city. Through his huge glass windows, he could see the whole world below him. Cars looked like tiny ants. People looked like dots. His assistant knocked on the door and said his son's school called again. Tommy got into another fight. David didn't look up from his computer and just said he'd handle it, but he never did. He never had time. David had everything except time. His wife Jennifer had left him 2 years ago. She took Tommy and moved across the city. David saw his son maybe once a month, sometimes less. Tommy was angry, sad, and lost, and David was too busy counting money to notice. Then came the phone call that broke his world into pieces. City Hospital called saying Tommy had collapsed at school and he needed to come now. David's heart stopped, and he ran faster than he'd ever run in his life. The doctor's words felt like knives cutting through him. Tommy had a rare heart condition and needed surgery, but it was very risky and very expensive. David laughed, not because it was funny, but because money was the one thing he had oceans of. He told the doctor he didn't care about the cost, just save his son. But the doctor looked uncomfortable and said something that changed everything. He said money can't fix everything. That Tommy's condition wasn't just physical, he was deeply unhappy and depressed, and the stress was making him worse. His body was giving up because his heart, emotionally, was already broken. The doctor explained that Tommy didn't want to live, and until he did, no surgery would save him. That night, David sat next to Tommy's hospital bed, watching his son look so small and fragile, connected to tubes and wires and machines that beeped softly in the dark. Tommy's quiet voice asked why Mom left, and David said it was complicated. But then Tommy said his mom told him that David loved money more than them, and asked if that was true. David felt tears burn his eyes and wondered when he last cried. He said no, that wasn't true, but deep down he knew it was. Tommy turned his face away and said everyone at school says he's rich, but he feels poor, and he'd give everything away if it meant his dad would just come to one soccer game. Just one. David's whole world cracked open because his son was dying, and it was his fault. For 3 days, David didn't leave the hospital, making phone calls and asking questions, talking to every doctor in the country. They all said the same thing, that Tommy needed a reason to fight, to want to live, to believe life was worth living. On the 4th day, Jennifer came to visit, and she looked tired and sad as she sat on the other side of Tommy's bed, holding his hand. She told David that Tommy talks about him all the time, that even after everything he loves his father, but he doesn't know him because David was always working, always gone. Tommy grew up thinking money was more important than him. David said he was building a future for Tommy, but Jennifer shook her head and said Tommy doesn't need a future, he needs a father right now, today. After she left, David sat in the dark hospital room and made a decision that would change everything. He would give up everything, not his money because Tommy would still have that if something happened, but David would give up his identity, his power, his comfortable life. He would become someone else, someone who had nothing, someone who could show his son what really mattered. David went home to his huge apartment one last time and looked at all his expensive things, his watches that cost more than cars, his suits that cost more than most people made in a month, his rare paintings and luxury furniture. None of it made him happy. None of it ever had. He called his most trusted employee Marcus and told him to run the company, to tell everyone David was traveling overseas for family reasons, but keep everything going and don't tell anyone where he really was. That night, David Carter, billionaire CEO and master of the universe, disappeared. In his place appeared someone new. David put on old worn clothes, messed up his hair, stopped shaving, and took only a small bag with basic things and $50 in his pocket. The next morning, he went to the hospital looking like a completely different person. Even the front desk nurse didn't recognize him. He found Tommy's doctor and said he wanted to stay with his son but needed the doctor to do something for him. To not tell Tommy who he really was, to tell him David was a friend, a volunteer, someone who helps out at the hospital. The doctor looked shocked, but David explained that his son was dying because he thinks money is what matters, and he needed to show him it's not. After a long pause, the doctor slowly nodded and agreed to help. The nurse cheerfully introduced Tommy to Dave, a volunteer who would be helping out on his floor and would be around if he needed anything. Tommy looked at the strange man with messy hair and old clothes and didn't recognize his own father. 3 months of stress, weight loss, and complete transformation had made David invisible to his own son. Tommy said hi quietly, and Dave asked if he liked soccer. Tommy's eyes lit up just a little and said yeah, he used to play before he got sick. Dave said maybe when he's feeling better they could kick a ball around the hallway, and for the first time in weeks Tommy smiled. David's heart broke and healed at the same time. Every day David came to the hospital wearing the same old clothes, eating cheap food from vending machines, sometimes even sleeping on uncomfortable chairs in the waiting room. But he was there every single day. He and Tommy talked, played card games, watched movies on an old tablet, drew pictures, and laughed. Slowly Tommy started to open up and told Dave that his real dad never has time for him. He's always working and making money, and his mom says his dad loves his company more than them. David swallowed hard and said maybe his dad is just scared. Tommy asked scared of what, and David explained that sometimes he's scared of failing, of not being good enough, and sometimes grown-ups make really stupid choices because they're afraid. One day a woman came to visit Tommy. She was in her 60s with kind eyes and gentle hands, wearing a simple dress and carrying a small bag of homemade cookies. Tommy's face lit up completely as he called out Grandma. David froze because it was his mother, Margaret Carter, and he hadn't seen her in almost 5 years, not since he'd gotten too busy for family dinners, too important for phone calls, too rich to remember where he came from. Margaret looked at the volunteer sitting with her grandson, and her eyes went wide as she whispered David's name in shock. He put a finger to his lips and mouthed, "Please," and she stared at him, at his dirty clothes, his messy appearance, his tired, genuine smile as he sat with Tommy. Tears filled her eyes, but she said loudly that he must be Dave, the volunteer Tommy keeps talking about, and thanked him for being so kind to her grandson. When Tommy fell asleep, Margaret pulled David into the hallway and asked what he was doing. David said simply that he was saving his son. She asked if he was really pretending to be poor and lying to Tommy, and David explained that he was showing Tommy what matters, that his son is dying not just physically but spiritually because he thinks money is everything. And that's all David ever showed him. Margaret looked at her son for a long moment and said he looked terrible. David admitted he'd been sleeping in his car and eating cheap food, living like he had nothing. She asked how it felt, and David thought about it, saying it was horrible and wonderful at the same time. He sees things he never saw before. People look through him now, and he's invisible. But Tommy sees him, really sees him for the first time ever. Margaret's eyes softened, and she told him he should have done this years ago. From that day forward, Margaret was David's only lifeline, bringing him food, clean clothes, a little money when he needed it, covering for him when questions were asked. She was the only person in the world who knew the truth, and she loved her son more for trying. Weeks passed, and Tommy got stronger, not because of medicine though that helped, but because he had a reason to wake up every day, his friend Dave who always showed up. One afternoon Jennifer came to visit and saw Dave sitting with Tommy playing cards and laughing. She asked who he was, and Tommy excitedly said, "This is Dave, his friend who's here every single day." Jennifer smiled at the volunteer and thanked him for being so kind to her son. Dave said Tommy's a special kid, and Jennifer replied bitterly that his father could learn something from him, that he hasn't visited in 2 weeks because he's too busy making money. Tommy's face fell, and he said he wished Dave was his dad instead. Jennifer looked shocked and told Tommy he doesn't mean that. But Tommy insisted yes he does because Dave cares about him and his dad only cares about work. David felt like his chest was being crushed. After Jennifer left, Tommy was quiet and sad. The light in his eyes had dimmed. David sat next to him and asked if he was okay, and Tommy asked if Dave thought his dad would ever change. David chose his words carefully and said people can change, but only when they realize what they're losing. Maybe Tommy's dad hasn't figured that out yet. Tommy asked what if he never does, and David said then that's his loss because Tommy is the most amazing kid he's ever met. Tommy suddenly hugged him tight and desperate, whispering that he wished Dave was his real dad, and David held his son and cried silently, whispering back that he wished he could be. Everything changed on a Tuesday. Tommy had been doing so much better that doctors said he could finally have the surgery because his spirit was stronger. He wanted to live and fight. David was overjoyed because his plan had worked. But then Jennifer arrived with news that shattered everything, saying David Carter wanted to see Tommy before the surgery. Tommy's face darkened, and he said he didn't want to see him. Jennifer pleaded that he's his father, but Tommy shouted that he's not, that Dave is more of a father than David Carter will ever be, and he didn't care if he never saw David Carter again. David sat in the corner, his heart dying inside his chest, because this wasn't the plan. Tommy was supposed to get better, and then David would reveal the truth. They would laugh and cry and hug, and everything would be perfect. But his son hated him now, the real him. That evening, Margaret found David sitting in the parking lot staring at nothing, and David said emptily that Tommy hates him. Margaret corrected him, saying Tommy hates who he was, but loves who he's become. David said, but he is David Carter. He can't just stop existing. Margaret said firmly that he can't go back to who he was before, because that David was already dead. He was killing himself and everyone around him. This David, the one sitting in parking lots and playing cards and showing up every single day. This is the David who deserves a son. David asked what he should do, and Margaret told him to tell Tommy the truth before the surgery, that he deserves to know. David shook his head, saying Tommy will hate him even more, but Margaret said maybe. But David will hate himself forever if he doesn't. The morning of the surgery, David asked to speak with Tommy alone. Tommy looked confused and asked where Dave was. David took a deep breath, his hands shaking, and said he needed to tell Tommy something important and needed him to listen carefully. He reminded Tommy how he said he wished Dave was his real dad, and then David said the words that changed everything. He told Tommy that he is Dave, and he's also David Carter, his father, the same person. Tommy's face went through 1,000 emotions: confusion, shock, anger, betrayal, and he said David was lying. David insisted he wasn't lying, explaining that 3 months ago when Tommy got sick he realized he'd been the worst father in the world. So he changed and gave up everything to be there with Tommy, to show him that money doesn't matter, that being present matters, that love matters. Tommy's voice rose as he asked if David lied to him this whole time, and David said he didn't know how else to reach him because Tommy hated him. Tommy screamed that he still hates him, that David lied and pretended to be someone else, and he dissolved into angry, hurt, broken tears. David reached for him, but Tommy pulled away, screaming for him to get out, saying he didn't want David at his surgery. He wanted Dave. He wanted his friend, not this liar. David stumbled out of the room, his entire world crumbling around him. David wasn't allowed in the surgery room, so he paced the hallway like a ghost while Margaret sat in the corner watching him fall apart. Jennifer arrived and confronted him, demanding to know what he did, because Tommy was crying and wouldn't stop right before surgery. David said he told Tommy the truth, and when Jennifer asked what truth, he explained everything: the disguise, the volunteer work, the transformation, all of it. Jennifer stared at him in disbelief, asking if he really gave up everything. And David said he had to because he had nothing before. Jennifer's anger melted as she looked at this broken man, her ex-husband, who had once valued money over everything, and she saw someone completely different. She said quietly that Tommy will forgive him, and when David asked how she knows, she said because she sees it now, that David really did change. The surgery took 6 hours, 6 hours of David walking in circles, praying to gods he didn't believe in, bargaining with the universe, begging please, please, please. Finally, the doctor emerged and said the surgery was successful and Tommy was going to be okay. David collapsed against the wall, sobbing with relief. Tommy didn't speak to David for 3 days, recovering in his hospital room surrounded by machines and refusing to see his father. David sat in the hallway waiting. On the 4th day, Margaret went in to talk to Tommy and told him his father was still out there. Tommy said he didn't care, but Margaret explained that David had been there for 4 days, hasn't left, hasn't eaten much, just waiting for Tommy to forgive him. Tommy said his dad lied to him, and Margaret agreed, but asked if he knew why. When Tommy didn't answer, she explained that he was dying, not just his body but his heart and spirit. He'd given up, and his father realized that all his money and power couldn't save him. The only thing that could save Tommy was love, real love, present love. Tommy asked if his dad pretended to be someone else, and Margaret said he became someone else, someone better, someone who showed up. Yes, he lied about his name, but everything else, every moment they spent together, that was real. That was his father being the person he should have been all along. After a long silence, Tommy asked if his dad was still out there, and when Margaret said yes, Tommy asked if he was still in those dirty clothes. Margaret smiled through tears and said yes, and Tommy quietly asked her to send him in. David walked into Tommy's room slowly, and his son looked small in the big hospital bed, but his eyes were stronger now, alive. They said hi to each other, and David asked how Tommy was feeling, and Tommy said better. The silence stretched between them like an ocean until David finally said he was so sorry for lying, for not being there before, for making Tommy think money mattered more than him, for everything. Tommy interrupted and asked why David did it. David sat down carefully and explained that Tommy was dying and it was his fault, not the sickness but the giving up. Tommy had stopped fighting because he thought life wasn't worth living, and David realized he'd taught him that by never being there, by always choosing work, he taught Tommy that he didn't matter. Tommy asked if David pretended to be poor, and David said he became poor in every way except money. He gave up his life to show Tommy that stuff doesn't matter, people matter, love matters, being present matters. He needed Tommy to see that before it was too late. Tommy asked about sleeping in the car and eating cheap food and people being mean, and David confirmed it all, saying they looked through him like he didn't exist. It was horrible, and it was the best 3 months of his life because he got to know Tommy, really know him. Tommy's eyes filled with tears, and he said he didn't understand, and David said he knows. Tommy asked if David gave up everything, and David said he gave up nothing because he had nothing before, but now he has Tommy. Tommy started crying harder, saying he said he wished David wasn't his dad, and David said he knows. Tommy said he didn't mean it. Well, he did, but he didn't, and David said he knows, buddy, he knows. Tommy asked if David was going back to being rich David Carter, and David thought carefully before answering. He said he's going to go back to his job because they need money to live, but he's never going back to being that person because that person was dead inside. This person, the one sitting here with Tommy, this is who he wants to be forever. Tommy asked him to promise, and David promised. Tommy asked if they could still play cards, and David laughed through his tears, saying every single day. Tommy held out his arms, and David pulled him into a gentle hug, careful of all the wires and tubes, and Tommy whispered that he loves his dad. David said he loves Tommy too, so much, more than anything in this world. 6 months later, David did go back to his job, back to his company, back to being a billionaire, but everything was different. He left work at 5 o'clock every single day with no exceptions. He went to every soccer game, every school play, every parent-teacher meeting. He sold his giant apartment and bought a smaller house closer to Jennifer and Tommy, not because he couldn't afford the big one, but because he didn't need it. He donated millions to the hospital that saved his son and created a program for sick kids whose parents couldn't afford to take time off work. He kept some of his old volunteer clothes in his closet, and sometimes when he felt himself slipping back into old habits, he'd put them on and remember what it felt like to have nothing and what it felt like to have everything. Tommy thrived and grew stronger. His heart healed both the physical one and the one that had been broken. One evening, as they kicked a soccer ball in the backyard, Tommy asked if his dad missed being super rich, and David smiled, saying he's still super rich. Tommy said he meant having all the fancy stuff, and David said the fancy stuff never made him happy, but this makes him happy, being with Tommy. Tommy grinned and said that's cheesy, Dad, and David said it's true though. They played until the sun set, painting the sky in orange and gold, and David Carter, billionaire CEO and former master of the universe, realized he'd finally found what he'd been searching for his whole life. Not success, not power, not money, but this simple, perfect moment with his son, his second chance, his redemption. Years later, Tommy would tell his own kids this story about the time his father became a beggar to save his life, about the time the richest man in the city ate from trash cans and slept in cars, about the time love proved more powerful than money. And he'd tell them the most important part, that his father didn't save him by being rich. He saved him by being poor, not in money but in pride, in ego, in everything that didn't matter. He became poor in all the ways that made him rich in the only way that counted, in love, presence, and truth. And that's the real ending. Not a happy one or a sad one, but a true one. The kind that breaks you open and puts you back together. The kind that reminds you that everything you're chasing might be running you away from everything you need. David Carter had owned the whole city, but he'd been owned by nothing until he lost everything and found the one thing that mattered: his son, his second chance, his redemption. And in the end, that was worth more than all the money in the world. Remember, the richest person isn't the one with the most money. It's the one who has enough love, enough time, enough presence, enough of what actually matters. Don't wait for a crisis to figure out what's important, because the people you love won't wait forever. Show up, be present, be poor in pride and rich in love, because that's the only wealth that lasts.